Back in the 1990s, there were few filmmakers as widely beloved as Robert Zemeckis. He was coming off a historic run of hits that not only were positively received by critics, but warmly embraced by audiences. Watch any interview and he'll tell you how he worked his ass off in the early part of his career, but by this point, he'd become a king. He'd reached the position all directors dream of, where just his name was enough to get a movie made. He was going through something of a horror phase at the time, mostly from spearheading HBO's Tales from the Crypt. Never lacking in ambition, though, he was about to announce a new, years long endeavor. As far as I'm aware, the only project of its kind. Always a tribute to his favorite director of all time, William Castle. Castle was most famous for a string of horror films he released throughout the 1950s and 60s, most of them entertaining enough, but mainly remembered for Castle's innovative and fun promotional gimmicks, from making theater chairs vibrate to simulate the monster from his film The Tingler, to putting a prop skeleton on wires and flinging it over the audience for some of his haunted house movies. Plenty of cinephiles dismissed his films as flashy nonsense, but he developed a devoted following. The notable example being Zemeckis' contemporary Joe Dante, who based the film Matinee on Castle's life. But Robert Zemeckis was not content for a one-film tribute like Joe Dante. Instead, he founded an entire production company, Dark Castle Entertainment. The company had one single goal, and that was to remake all of William Castle's most famous scary movies for a new, younger audience. Think about that for a second. An entire studio devoted solely to reimagining the work of one filmmaker. It was unheard of, but so are a lot of the things Robert Zemeckis did throughout his career. Knowing where things ended up with this venture, it might be hard to imagine just how much hype this idea generated. Zemeckis wasn't directing any of these films, true, but he'd already proven to be a solid producer by that point in his career. And while the horror genre has always been stalwart amongst changing taste and industry uncertainty, it was pulling in big business in the late 90s. Movies like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer were conquering the box office, and reimaginings of old monster movies were happening left and right. Dracula, The Mummy, Frankenstein, even The Haunting were all getting shiny new adaptations, and the appetite seemed to be there for what Dark Castle was aiming for. Their first remake, House on Haunted Hill, was certainly in the spirit of one of Castle's movies, right down to a showy marketing gimmick. See, like in the original film, the main characters of House on Haunted Hill are staying in a famously haunted house for a cash prize, and moviegoers had a chance to get one of their own. That's right, they would pay you to see this movie. Kind of. Each ticket stub had a scratch-off on the back, and one lucky ticket holder would win $1 million American. I couldn't find much info on if Warner's actually paid out the prize, but it hardly matters. They never did any other kind of promotional campaign like it for the other Dark Castle movies. House on Haunted Hill was released on October 29th, 1999, and it did fine. It was a modest commercial success, although critics were far from won over by it. Of all the ones I watched, this one seemed like the closest to Zemeckis' original idea, essentially trying to bring the tone and hype of a Castle film into the 90s. But I've seen plenty of better haunted house movies, it must be said. Zemeckis, however, was undeterred, so they stayed the course. Up next for a new hot reimagining was Castle's other most iconic film, 13 Ghosts. I understand that this movie has something of a fan base now, but honestly, the nicest thing I can say about it is it does try harder to be distinct from the original than House on Haunted Hill did. And that's much kinder than what people said at the time. It was savaged by critics. Not all that out of the ordinary back then. Honestly, until about a decade ago, it was a matter of principle for most mainstream critics to hate horror films. But audiences couldn't stand it either. It was loud, annoying, and didn't seem to carry the spirit of William Castle's work. Worst of all, it ate shit at the box office, not even coming close to recouping its production costs. Dark Castle was well-intentioned, but the plan wasn't working. They needed to change course. So, Zemeckis and co. altered their North Star a little bit. What if instead of remaking William Castle's movies, they made an original film in the spirit of William Castle, something that he conceivably would direct were he still alive? And that is how you get something like Ghost Ship, the spooky tale of a group of thieves who find themselves on a legendary lost cruise liner from the 1960s where supernatural hijinks ensue. Look, it was a nice idea, and there is some good atmosphere, but it's the same director as the last installment. It made some money, but it was even worse reviewed than 13 Ghosts, and I can see why, although the opening is a banger. The final nail in the whole venture came next with 2005's reimagining of House of Wax. Another remake, not of a castle film, but hey, it was the same era and it had Vincent Price in it, so close enough, I guess. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the larger budget for so many of these, but it's one of the most striking aspects of all of these films. It might not seem like much today, but a horror movie with that much money poured into it was really something special back then. And the larger budget is a big positive for House of Wax. There's lots of practical effects that are still impressive to this day. Funnily enough, despite largely being one of the stronger entries in the whole Dark Castle project, at least in my opinion, it's also the easiest one to point to as to why it didn't work. They punched above their weight class, plain and simple. The films of William Castle are fine, they're entertaining, but House of Wax is a stone cold classic with great performances, most notably from Vincent Price, and an incredible central premise. The remake, while above average for a 2000s horror film, at least in my opinion, just isn't in the same league. Nowadays, it's probably best remembered as being one of the few movies to star Paris Hilton, and in what was becoming a Dark Castle staple, critics hated it and audiences didn't show up. Another bomb. By this time, it was clear that however pure Zemeckis' intentions were when the company started, sometimes it just doesn't work out like he planned. So, what happened next? Given the number of flops and the fact that the filmmaker who started all this had lost interest for greener pastures, you might assume that Dark Castle closed its doors, but actually, the opposite happened. All pretense of the original idea had been dropped, they just started fresh, made some horror and action films, and to a degree achieved success. Looking at the list of productions, it seems to me like they still miss more often than they hit, but they've had winners in there. Mostly cult hits, films like Orphan and Splice, and in a way, they did become a modern equivalent to filmmakers like William Castle. They didn't make the biggest splash, but plenty of these movies, nostalgia goggles or not, are thought of pretty highly by folks of my generation, and they still make movies to this day. Their latest film, Last Breath, released less than a month ago to positive reviews.
What did we learn, Palmer?
Was this idea ever going to work? Probably not, but Robert Zemeckis is committed to so many bonkers ideas, I could fill dozens of videos with them. Something about this whole thing is almost childlike. I find it charming. It's like a kid who's seen a movie he loves so many times, he remakes it with his action figures, but on a larger budget on a Hollywood scale. Anyway, that concludes the story of Dark Castle. This is T Quinton 1 signing out.